I lay in the hospital bed, broken and bandaged, while my husband held his mistress' hand. He told me I was a burden and that he had already sold our house. He did not know that only hours before the crash, I had signed the final papers for a $48 million inheritance. My name is Audrey, and at 33 years old, I thought I understood the concept of pain, but I was wrong. As a dedicated archivist dealing with antiques, I spent my life preserving the past, but I never expected my own future to be shattered in a single second. I lay in the sterile white room of the ICU, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, which was the only proof that I was still alive. My body felt heavy, like it was filled with lead, and a searing pain radiated from my legs up to my spine. I tried to shift my weight, but my lower body refused to obey, and panic began to rise in my chest, tightening my throat. I remembered the rain-slicked road and the blinding headlights of the truck that swerved into my lane. I remembered the overwhelming joy I had felt just moments before the impact, because I was rushing home to tell Gavin, my husband of 5 years, that our lives were about to change forever. The elderly man I had cared for as an archivist had left me everything. But now, as I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, the reality of my situation crashed down on me. A nurse walked in, but her face held no compassion as she flipped through a clipboard at the end of my bed, without even making eye contact. She told me I was finally awake and that we needed to discuss a discharge plan because my insurance had flagged my coverage. I tried to speak to ask about my husband, but my voice came out as a raspy whisper. The nurse sighed as if I was wasting her time and informed me that Mr. Vance had been there while I was unconscious to sign consent forms for my treatment. I felt a wave of relief thinking Gavin had taken care of things, but then the nurse delivered the blow that shattered my hope. She told me he had declined the reconstructive surgery for my legs. He claimed it was too expensive and the recovery time was too long, so he opted for the standard casting method instead to save about $40,000. She was honest with me and said that without that surgery, my chances of walking normally again were less than 10%, and I would likely need a cane or a wheelchair for the rest of my life. I stared at her in disbelief as the world spun around me. Gavin, who spent thousands on golf club memberships and custom suits, had decided that my ability to walk was not worth the money. He chose to leave me disabled to save cash. The pain in my legs was excruciating, but the pain in my heart was worse, as I realized I wasn't a wife to him, but a line item in a budget he was trying to cut. The door to my hospital room did not just open, it flew open with a force that made the metal frame rattle. I flinched instinctively, expecting a doctor with a medical emergency, but instead I saw the immaculate silhouette of my husband Gavin standing in the doorway. He was wearing his charcoal gray Italian suit, the one he saved for closing, million-dollar deals, and his hair was perfectly gelled, without a single strand out of place. He smelled of expensive cologne and ozone from the rain outside, but there were no flowers in his hands and no look of relief on his face. Instead, he held a thick, crumpled envelope that looked like a weapon. He marched to the side of my bed, not to hold my hand or kiss my forehead, but to glare at me with eyes that were cold and calculating. "About time," he said, his voice completely devoid of warmth. He asked if I had any idea how much this little nap of mine was costing him per hour. Before I could even whisper his name or ask for a sip of water, he threw the envelope onto my chest. The corners of the stiff paper dug into my bruised skin, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shock of his hostility. I looked down through blurred vision and saw that it was not a get-well-soon card, but a preliminary billing statement from the hospital. The numbers were staggering, and I managed to croak out a question asking what this was. Gavin sneered, leaning over the bed rail so his face was just inches from mine, and told me this was the bill for my incompetence. He yelled that I took the Porsche without asking his Porsche that he had just finished paying off and that I had wrapped it around a guardrail. He told me the car was a total loss and that he had stood there in the rain watching the firefighters cut me out of the twisted metal, thinking only about the depreciation value. I tried to defend myself, telling him it was an accident and that the truck had swerved into my lane, but he didn't care. He told me he had already spoken to the insurance adjusters, and because there were no witnesses, he had suggested that I might have been distracted or impaired. He admitted that he did what he had to do to protect his financial standing and his policy record. He told me I was on my own with the hospital bills, and that he hoped I had a secret stash of cash hidden in my dusty antique books. because he was certainly not ruining his credit score to fix my mistakes. I looked at the man I had shared a bed with for 5 years, and I didn't see a husband, I saw a predator who had been waiting for me to fall. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room as Gavin adjusted his silk tie and checked his reflection in the darkened hospital window. He was fixing a strand of hair and ensuring his perfection remained intact, while my life lay in ruins. I realized then that the man standing before me was not just selfish. He was a sociopath who had planned this long before the crash. The accident had simply given him the perfect excuse to accelerate his timeline. But the humiliation was not over. Just as I was trying to process the fact that he had sabotaged my insurance and my health, the door opened again and a woman walked in. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with long honey blonde hair and wearing a designer trench coat that cost more than my first car. She didn't look like a nurse or a concerned relative. She walked straight over to Gavin and looped her arm through his with an air of ownership. This was Jasmine, the woman I had seen in the background of Gavin's social media photos. For months, the one he claimed was just a junior associate at his firm. She looked at me not with pity, but with a sickening smugness. She pulled a set of keys from her pocket and jingled them. They were the keys to our house, my house that my parents had helped us buy. Gavin didn't even flinch as he told me that Jasmine was moving in and that he had already packed my things into garbage bags. He said that since I was going to be a burden and likely stuck in a wheelchair, I wouldn't be able to navigate the stairs of our colonial-style home anyway. He called me a broken antique that was no longer worth the restoration costs. Jasmine giggled and leaned her head on his shoulder, whispering loud enough for me to hear that the hospital smell was giving her a headache. She told Gavin they should go because they had a reservation at the club. Before they left, Gavin leaned down one last time and whispered that he had already filed for divorce while I was in the coma. He said that because of the way he had structured our prenuptial agreement and the fact that he was claiming I was at fault for the accident, I would get nothing. No alimony, no house, and no medical support. He told me to look at Jasmine and see what success looked like, and then he pointed at me and said I was exactly what I was worth, which was nothing. They walked out of the room together, laughing, leaving me alone with the beeping monitor and a bill for a surgery I couldn't afford. They didn't know that the inheritance papers in my bag were worth $48 million and that I was about to become the most powerful person they had ever crossed. The discharge from the hospital was not the triumphant return home I had once imagined. It was a cold and clinical transaction. Because Gavin had declined the surgery and sabotaged my insurance, the hospital administration was eager to clear my bed for a paying patient. 2 orderlies who didn't even know my name hoisted me into a standard manual wheelchair and pushed me toward the exit. They didn't speak to me as they maneuvered the chair through the sliding glass doors into the biting autumn air. They pushed me right to the edge of the curb and told me good luck before turning around and walking back into the warmth of the lobby. I was left alone in the thin hospital gown, shivering uncontrollably as the rain began to fall. I clutched the yellow plastic bag containing my only possessions, my wallet, my keys, and a folder of documents against my chest. My cast was already soaking, up the water becoming heavy and freezing against my skin. I felt discarded like a piece of trash. Then I heard the roar of an engine, and I looked up to see a sleek black SUV peeling out of the hospital parking garage. It was Gavin's car. I could see them through the tinted windshield as they drove past. Gavin had one hand on the wheel, and the other was draped around Jasmine as they laughed together. They didn't even look toward the curb where I sat shivering. They were heading to my house to sleep in my bed while I was sitting on a sidewalk with nowhere to go. I reached into the plastic bag with trembling fingers and pulled out the thick leather-bound folder. Inside were the papers I had signed just hours before the accident. My mentor, the man I had spent years assisting in his archives, had no living relatives and had viewed me as the daughter he never had. The documents confirmed that the estate, including properties in London and New York, a private art collection, and liquid assets totaling $48 million, was now mine. Gavin thought he had left me with nothing, but he had actually walked away from the biggest fortune he would ever see. I pulled out my phone, which had a cracked screen from the crash, and dialed a number I had memorized. The voice on the other end was deep and professional. It was Mr. Sterling, the estate lawyer. He had been trying to reach me for days. Told him where I was and that I needed help immediately. I didn't tell him I was broken or that I was crying. I told him I needed a private ambulance, a specialized surgical team, and the most aggressive litigation firm in the state. Within 20 minutes, a luxury medical transport arrived, and the paramedics treated me with a level of respect I hadn't felt in weeks. As they lifted me into the vehicle, I looked back at the hospital one last time. I wasn't just going to heal, I was going to rebuild. Gavin wanted to play a game of financial chess, but he didn't realize I had just inherited the entire board. The next 3 months were a blur of white-walled surgical suites and grueling physical therapy that pushed me to the edge of my sanity. While Gavin and Jasmine were busy playing house in my colonial home and spending Gavin's dwindling commission checks on lavish parties, I was being rebuilt by the finest surgeons money could buy. Mr. Sterling had organized a private wing at a specialized clinic, where I underwent the complex reconstructive procedures Gavin had denied me. Every morning I woke up to the smell of antiseptic and the sight of my own legs encased in high-tech braces, but I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a weapon being forged in a fire. I used my inheritance to hire the best trainers and nutritionists, and while the pain of relearning to walk was immense, it was fueled by a cold-burning desire for justice. While my body was healing, I was working even harder with my legal team. I discovered that Gavin had been even more reckless than I thought. He hadn't just cheated on me, he had been embezzling funds from his own firm to maintain the illusion of wealth for Jasmine. He had leveraged his position to take out loans against properties he didn't fully own, including our house. I sat in my hospital bed with a laptop across my lap and watched as Mr. Sterling's team began the process of a silent takeover. I didn't want him to know I was coming. I instructed my lawyers to buy up the debt on Gavin's firm through an anonymous holding company named after the archive where I used to work. Within weeks, I was effectively his landlord and his primary creditor, without him even knowing my name was on the paperwork. Every time Gavin used his corporate credit card to buy Jasmine a designer handbag or a bottle of vintage wine, I received an alert. I was watching him dig his own grave with a golden shovel. I also found out that he had never actually finalized the divorce papers. He had just used them as a scare tactic. While I was in the ICU, he was waiting for me to sign away my rights so he could claim the house as his sole property before the bank realized he was insolvent. I decided to wait to let him get comfortable in his lies. I watched through private investigators as they hosted a housewarming party in the home I had decorated. Jasmine wore my jewelry and drank from my crystal glasses, while Gavin bragged about his successful life. The day finally came when the doctors cleared me to walk without a cane. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my private suite, wearing a sharp-tailored power suit that cost more than Gavin's entire car collection. My legs were strong, and my gaze was steady. I had spent $6 million on my recovery and the legal groundwork for my return, and I still had $42 million left. I called Mr. Sterling and told him it was time to pull the rug out from under them. I wanted the eviction notices served on the day of Gavin's biggest career achievement, the annual real estate gala, where he expected to be named partner. I wasn't just going to take back my house, I was going to take back my dignity and everything he thought he had stolen from me. The night of the annual real estate gala was a spectacle of vanity and false prestige. The grand ballroom was filled with the city's elite, and right at the center of the room stood Gavin, looking more arrogant than ever. He was wearing a new tuxedo and holding a glass of champagne, while Jasmine clung to his arm, draped in a red silk dress that was clearly bought with his company's emergency credit line. Gavin was basking in the attention, telling everyone within earshot that he was the top candidate for the senior partnership. He was laughing and telling jokes, acting as if his wife had never existed or had simply faded away into a hospital bed somewhere. He was at the peak of his perceived power, but he didn't realize that the walls were already closing in. I arrived at the gala, not as the broken woman he had left on the curb, but as the majority shareholder of the very firm he worked for. I walked through the double doors with a stride that was smooth and confident, thanks to the months of expensive surgery and therapy. I wore a custom black gown with a high collar and a diamond necklace that was a centerpiece of my new collection. When I stepped into the room, the chatter didn't just die, it vanished. People didn't recognize me at first, because the Audrey they knew was the quiet archivist who stayed in the shadows. Now I was radiant and formidable. I saw Gavin's face turn from a smug smile to a mask of pure terror as our eyes met across the room. He dropped his glass, and it shattered on the marble floor, sending shards of crystal and champagne flying. He tried to recover his composure, but his hands were shaking as he gripped Jasmine's shoulder. I didn't rush toward him. I walked slowly, savoring every step. As I approached the VIP table, Mr. Sterling and a team of 4 process servers in dark suits stepped out from the shadows behind me. Gavin tried to play it off, calling out my name and asking what I was doing there, but his voice was thin and desperate. Jasmine started to say something insulting, but she stopped when she saw the look in my eyes. I didn't say a word. I simply gestured to Mr. Sterling, who stepped forward and began to lay out a series of documents on the table in front of Gavin, like a deck of cards. The first was a formal notice of his termination from the firm for gross financial misconduct and embezzlement. The second was a foreclosure notice on our colonial home, which was now owned by my holding company. The third was a lawsuit for the return of all personal property, including the jewelry Jasmine was currently wearing. And the final blow was the divorce counterpetition, including proof of his insurance fraud and the attempt on my life through medical neglect. The room was silent as the most influential people in the industry watched Gavin's life dissolve in real time. He looked down at the papers and then back at me, his mouth hanging open. I leaned in close enough to smell his expensive cologne and whispered that he was right about one thing. I was an archivist, and I had just finished filing him away into the past. Gavin tried to scream, and he tried to make a scene, but the security team I had hired was already moving in to escort him and Jasmine out of the ballroom. He looked like a cornered animal, his face turning a blotchy red as he realized that the audience he had spent years trying to impress was now looking at him with nothing but disgust. Jasmine started to cry, but it wasn't the crying of a heartbroken woman. It was the frantic sobbing of someone who realized her meal ticket had just been canceled. As they were led away, I stood there amidst the silence and the whispers, feeling a strange sense of calm. I didn't stay for the rest of the gala. I had no interest in their shallow praise. I walked out of the ballroom and straight into my waiting limousine, where Mr. Sterling was already waiting with the keys to my house. When I arrived at the colonial home, it was nearly midnight. The house was dark, but the front door was slightly ajar, as if they had left in a hurry. I walked inside, and the first thing I noticed was the smell of Jasmine's cheap perfume and the clutter of a life that didn't belong here. They had treated my home like a hotel room. I walked through the living room and saw that they had replaced my antique furniture with modern gaudy pieces that lacked soul. In the kitchen, there were empty wine bottles and dirty plates scattered across the marble countertops. I went upstairs to the master bedroom and found my clothes thrown into the back of the closet while Jasmine's designer bags were proudly displayed. It was a physical representation of how Gavin had tried to erase me. But the real discovery came when I opened the safe in the office. Gavin had tried to empty it, but in his haste, he had dropped several pieces of my family jewelry on the floor. He had also left behind a folder of correspondence that confirmed my suspicions. He hadn't just been cheating, he had been planning to sell the house and move to Europe with Jasmine using the BAO, insurance money he expected to get from my death. He had even looked into life insurance policies for me just weeks before the accident. The depth of his depravity was bottomless. I sat in the darkness of the office for a long time, holding my grandmother's diamond ring, which I had found tucked under a rug. I realized that the house didn't feel like home anymore because it had been poisoned by their presence. I called my assistant and gave a series of instructions. I wanted every single thing they had touched removed from the house by morning. Anything that belonged to them was to be put into garbage bags and left on the sidewalk just as Gavin had done to me. Anything that couldn't be cleaned was to be burned or donated. I wanted the house stripped to the studs and redecorated from scratch. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the back porch, watching the sunrise over the garden. I was no longer the broken woman on the curb. I was the owner of a fortune and the architect of my own recovery. Gavin and Jasmine were now out in the cold with no money, no jobs, and a mountain of legal trouble. And I was just getting started with the final phase of my plan. The final confrontation happened not in a courtroom or a ballroom, but in the cold gray light of a Monday morning outside the local precinct. Gavin had been brought in for questioning regarding the embezzlement charges, and Jasmine had been detained for possession of stolen property, namely the jewelry she had tried to smuggle out in her dress. I watched from the back of my car as they were released on a meager bail that had likely drained the last of Gavin's hidden accounts. They looked haggard and small, standing on the cracked pavement without their designer clothes or their masks of arrogance. Gavin saw my car and tried to run toward it. His face twisted in a mix of rage and desperation, but my security team blocked him before he could get within 10 feet. I rolled down the window just an inch to let him see my face one last time. He started shouting that I couldn't do this to him, that he had built my life, and that I owed him. I didn't feel anger anymore, only a profound sense of pity for a man who still didn't understand the difference between price and value. I told him through the glass that he was wrong about one thing: he hadn't built my life. He had only been a squatter in it. I told him that the colonial house had already been sold, and the proceeds were being donated to the hospital wing that specialized in reconstructive surgery for those without insurance. Every penny he had tried to steal was now going to fix the very thing he had tried to break in me. Jasmine stood behind him, shivering in the wind, her fake lashes peeling off, and her red silk dress stained and ruined, and she looked at me with a terror that finally matched the gravity of her situation. I signaled for the driver to pull away, and as the car glided toward the highway, I reached into the pocket of my coat and felt the old wedding ring, the one Gavin had given me when we were young and poor. It felt like a heavy anchor to a past that no longer existed. We reached the bridge that spanned the city river, and I asked the driver to slow down. I rolled the window all the way down and let the rushing air fill the cabin. I held the ring out over the water for a moment, watching it catch the morning light. It was just a piece of metal, a symbol of a contract that had been broken by blood and greed. I let it go and watched it disappear into the gray depths of the water without a splash. The weight that had been sitting on my chest since the hospital bed finally evaporated. I leaned back into the leather seat and looked out at the city skyline. My journey was no longer about revenge. It was about the freedom that came after the fire. I had $40 million, a body that could walk, and a mind that was finally clear. Gavin and Jasmine would spend the next decade in and out of courtrooms and prison cells, fighting over the scraps of their ruined reputations. But I was already gone. I told the driver to take me to the airport, where a private jet was waiting to take me to the archives in London. I had spent my life preserving the history of others, but now I was the one writing the future. As the car sped up, I realized that the woman on the curb was dead, and the woman in the car was finally home within herself. The world was vast, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just observing it, I was owning it,